been 2 weeks since Easter Sunday. 1 week for Susan and Greek Easter Sunday, but 2 weeks from our Easter Sunday. What'd you have for dinner? Did you go to brunch? What'd you do? We haven't gotten a chance to talk. Last week we were remembering Earth Sunday. Today's Easter, third Sunday. 2 weeks later, what'd you have for Easter dinner? Who was there? I want to know these things. Did you have lamb? I didn't. It was too expensive this year, and I didn't feel like preaching and cooking both on the same day, so Patrick and I went out. Did you do anything? Did family come visit? Did you go visit family? If I hadn't have started by asking what you did, would you have even remembered that Easter was just 2 weeks ago? Or are you busy counting down already until 50 weeks from now when it comes again? Do you know that it's still Easter? This is called Eastertide, a beautiful nautical image of this season, of this tide that is going out, or theologically, going up. Eastertide. It makes me think of beaches and oceans and summery places that I know many of us have our eyes fixed upon. Our scripture today, which Lynn just read, which is a favorite of many of you, I know, begins with these words. Now on that same day, which is a really wonderful kind of opening sentence to situate exactly what day we're talking about, except that the people who divided the lectionary up into, or the scripture up into lectionary, who gave it our little chunks, never quite understood the concept of vague pronouns. They're all the time dropping us into these stories saying, now on that same day, with no antecedent in sight. Or they'll say, and he continued, with no idea of who that he was. This is a problem, and we often try to fix it. Sometimes we don't, because sometimes we don't bother to go back and read the verses that we skipped. But let me tell you which day we're talking about this day. This day is Easter Sunday that they're talking about. The scripture today is later in the day, on that same day that was Easter Sunday. Now, scripture doesn't describe it as Easter Sunday. They don't yet use this word. The same day that scripture is talking about, that Luke is remembering, is that same day which began with the women at the tomb. An event that happened much, much earlier, when the women got up and took the spices and went to the tomb and met it empty and encountered an angel, and then met Jesus, and then made it all the way home to tell the men who were just having a Sunday morning lie-in, who promptly didn't believe them, and so a little bit later send others of them out, the men folk, to go verify what the women had said, as if the women needed the men to confirm that what they said was true, but 2,000 years later, we still work on this fact. Here it is Easter afternoon. And two of them, Simon Peter and this guy Cleopas, who we've not met before, you don't need to know that name until now. Now you need to know his name. He's walking along, they're walking along to Emmaus. They've left Jerusalem. They've had their male buddies tell them, yep, the women weren't lying, the tomb is empty. But the male buddies are equally still ticked off because by the time they got to the tomb, the angels were gone. They didn't get to meet Jesus. The women were right, the tomb's empty, and I guess we'll have to believe them that there were angels in Jesus, but I really wish that he would have shown up for me. Would that have been too much to ask Jesus? And so these two are walking along. They're walking along to Emmaus. This is 7 miles away from Jerusalem. Here down to the Bowery, and then a little bit further. If you're walking at a quick pace or keeping pace and not stopping for lunch, maybe an hour and a half, 2 hours. And as these two walk along, Simon Peter and Cleopas, Jesus pulls up alongside them, starts walking along with them. Hey, what have you been up to? Why the long faces? And they respond with an interesting question. I rather like this in Scripture. Are you the only person in all of Nazareth and Jerusalem who doesn't know what's been happening these last 3 days? And Jesus, as if he's been under a rock, which, hey, he's been under a rock, doesn't know what they're talking about. So Jesus says, what? And this I just love because it's, God, God's self, the creator of all of humanity, The Word that was there in the beginning says to two of God's own disciples, I don't know, you tell me. And they do. They pass the test with flying colors. They tell everything. From that Last Supper, from the costly jar of nard, from that breaking of bread, to the betrayal, to the trial, to the crucifixion, to that morning. With questions. They don't know all the answers that we have, as if we know any of the answers now, but they don't have the answers that 2,000 years of pastors and theologians and church historians have taught us about the day. But they tell him all that they know that Easter afternoon. And some of the best things that they tell, these kind of late-to-rise guys with a bit of that chip on their shoulder about why they didn't get to see Jesus that morning, some of the things they tell him are that some of the women we know went to the tomb and they found angels. Can you believe that? And they told him that it sounded so good that some of their friends went out to double check. They didn't see the angels. They repeat this a lot. But they did find an empty tomb, so resurrection must have happened. But can you believe it? The women actually saw Jesus too. He was there. How? You can hear them say. And Jesus, like any good teacher or parent, a rabbi or a pastor, or a good therapist knows, sometimes it's best to just let out a little more rope. Let's see what they're going to do with it if I just give them a little more rope. Keep telling me, says Jesus. And they do. And then Jesus, apparently no more kind or patient, or suffering fools no more gladly dead than he did when he was alive, he gives to them a full-on scripture lesson. He calls them foolish, and he says, let me tell you about Moses. And from Moses all the way forward, Jesus walks us through all of Hebrew scripture and all of what was becoming the new covenant and all the history that pertained to him. He tells them. I really wish I was there for that lecture. I would have really loved to have heard what Jesus had to say about himself as the fulfillment of all of Hebrew scripture. Sadly, neither Simon Peter nor Cleopas were very good writers or journalists, and so they didn't bother to write it down. And by the time it gets to Luke, some 40 years later, nobody quite knows the content of that conversation. It's like all of Paul's letters, where we don't know what they were complaining about in Corinth, but we know why Paul's yelling at them. We don't know what exactly was wrong in Rome, but we know that Paul writes the Romans a great deal of heavy theology. Here, Scripture simply says, he told them everything about the Hebrew Scriptures and how he is the fulfillment of them. Not a great redaction here, scripture writers. I would really like the details as somebody who studies theology and looks at secondary sources. Somebody who goes back to read the text to find out what were they talking about. I like to know the antecedents. I like to know the proper noun to which we are referring, and I want to understand why it was left out. Well, it's left out, but Jesus told them, and they believed them. They didn't bother to write it down. We don't know if they told anybody else after this. But they did one thing that I think is really interesting. They invited him to dinner. And this is funny, because as far as we know, and contrary to what the Egyptians thought, dead people don't eat. But never one to refuse an invitation, Jesus accepts. It's rather like when I go to a dinner party and Patrick says, shouldn't you tell them what you're allergic to? And I say, no, don't be rude, I'll just pick around it. But Jesus just goes along. No, don't worry about it. I can't actually eat fish or bread. I'm dead, you see, but I'll just pretend. And together, the three of them have what we now know was the first Easter Sunday dinner. Imagine that dinner with me. There probably weren't chocolate bunnies yet, or tie-dyed eggs. There definitely weren't fluorescent pink peeps. I doubt there was a coconut cake, which is really their loss, but lamb's a possibility. So too would have been fish. And I'm sure there was wine. This is 3 days after the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth. Turns out the man who's sitting there at the table with them, but they don't know this yet. This is before it's Easter Sunday. This is probably before that Friday was Good Friday. And one of my questions about this dinner is it a celebration or is it a wake? Are any of our Easter dinners a celebration or are they a wake? Jesus had just died. None of the Gospels had been written. It's possible, given the ancient Near East lifespan, that the Gospel writers of Luke and John may not even have been born yet. But all of Jerusalem is abuzz, so much so that Simon and Cleopas say to Jesus, "Are you the only one who doesn't know what's been going on?" And yet, it was a celebration. 2 friends made a 3rd friend, and they welcomed him to dinner. Atonement theology hadn't yet come upon anybody's minds. We didn't yet know why sacrifice was necessary in atonement theology, or entirely not necessary in liberation theology. What we knew was Jesus' message of healing and teaching and walking with and making friends out of strangers. And this was good enough for that first Sunday evening. There was an Easter dinner. And as maybe happened at some of your Easter dinners, there was a blessing over that meal. One of them said grace. Now, the grace at that first Easter dinner was said by Jesus. And again, I find myself really wishing I could have been there or that somebody would have bothered to write down what he said. But it does lead me to the question of who says grace at your dinner tables? Do you say grace at dinner? How many people need to be at your table in order for grace to be said? If it's just yourself, do you say it? If there are just 2 of you, do you kind of skip past it? If the kids are home, do you definitely say it because you're teaching them to say grace all the time? If the grandparents and the kids are both at the table, you're certainly saying grace. Which one of you says it? How many friends do you have to have there, or what friends of what variety will you pray in front of? When you have a big holiday table, who says grace? Do they write it out beforehand? Do they use the words from some book? Or does grace take more the form of a toast rather than a prayer? That's still grace. On our first Thanksgiving together many years ago, it was just Patrick and me, and we were in our apartment downtown, and I don't know what had happened that year, but it was one of those years where we worked right up until Thursday at noon, both of us, and nobody had time to issue invitations or accept invitations or travel. And sitting there at that table, just the 2 of us, and I don't remember what I made, but Patrick said, "Are you going to say grace?" And I looked at my husband, who is not a church-going man. Sorry, my in-laws are online. You know this. And said, "What? Why would I do that?" And Patrick said, "Because I like it when you do." And we did. I said grace that first Thanksgiving Thursday night, just the 2 of us. And we still say grace at tables, typically at big tables, holiday tables, and it always catches me off guard because I'm generally the cook and the preparations and all the stressor and all the things and have issued the invitations. And by the time I get to the table, I generally fall into my chair with a kind of, that thud of the host that knows, like, all right, the soup's down, the turkey's carved, I'm putting this down, and I'm not moving until the dishes are done, and I'm not doing those. So somebody else will do that, and then I will relax. And then, this is when my husband typically says over a group of 10 or 12 around the table, babe, are you saying grace? Yes, Patrick, I'll say grace. But I don't know what Jesus said that first Easter Sunday, and that would be a really good prayer to have in a book of common prayers for holidays. But I'll tell you what, whatever we say, whoever says grace at your house, whoever says grace at my house, I'm going to start punting that question. Any of you who get invitations, be warned. Patrick's laughing, but be warned. None of the prayers that I've ever said, none of the prayers that have ever been said for me, none of the prayers that have ever been said in my presence, as powerful as they have been, as much as I have felt the power of prayer in my life, none of them have done the miracle that happened when Jesus prayed. When Jesus took bread at that table, remembering the bread he had taken just 4 days earlier, and gives a blessing, scales fall from the eyes of the two that he is with. That's the language that Scripture gives us. Scales fall from their eyes. I rather think scales must have been tears. They must have been the tears that they'd been crying for 3 days since that crucifixion. You know how long it takes to get tears out of an eye when a loved one dies, when the whole world changes, when you think you've moved on, but where the darndest little thing can cause you to break down. You find yourself sobbing for no reason. There in that grace, the tears didn't just fall from their eyes, they vanished from their eyes. And for the first time all afternoon, for the first time probably since Friday, probably since Thursday, probably for a few weeks before, these two could see clearly. And they saw that it was Jesus right there. He hadn't changed. He'd been with them all afternoon. The prayer that he said didn't change God, it didn't change him, but it changed the people he was with. They could see. They could see him. And they could see themselves with him. This, of course, is the basis of our theology, a theology that looks for the risen Christ in the eyes of each stranger that we pass on the street. This is what we preach and practice every week at West End Church. So the disciples, they get up from that table, they've seen the risen Lord, they've had bread, they've had some wine, and they've realized they've got a 7-mile walk home. So they do. And an hour and a half or 2 hours later, probably more towards 2, maybe a little bit more, I doubt they were walking with quite the same gait as they were earlier, but maybe they were so excited. Maybe they couldn't wait to tell this story. They get back home, and the 11 other disciples are waiting there for them. It's later in the evening, of course. And they confirmed for the disciples again that they have seen Jesus, and that all that the women said was true, not just because the women said it, not just because we saw an empty tomb, but I have seen Jesus. This game of one-upsmanship that we like to play in church goes all the way back to this first Easter Sunday when we said, yes, I know you saw an empty tomb, but I actually saw Jesus. Did you? Yes, I saw Jesus. He took the scales out of my eyes. Really? How many holes did he have? Put his hand here, Thomas. That's a story for another time. But the doubting and the one-upsing continues and continues this entire Easter season. And there, late at night on that first Easter Sunday, after the dinner has been had, as the port is being shared, as whiskeys are being poured, the closest family sat well into the night talking about all that had been. This is often the best part of a holiday, isn't it? That moment when the guests leave and it's just family and the guests that are staying in your apartment or in your house. It's just the closest, the intimates who hang back doing dishes, packing leftovers, sneaking morsels to the dogs. It's their holiday too, your mother says. And it's that moment when you realize something special has happened. It's when you're looking back through the vaguest, softest cloud of memory. The time when you go over the day's events in your mind and chat it up with your husband or your daughter-in-law, and it's when you make meaning out of what happened. The work of reminiscence is the work of meaning-making. Remembering and sharing our memories with one another and having one another validate our memories is how our brains codify memory. Neuroscience tells us this, that what we say and what is repeated back to us gets coded in how we think. On that first Easter Sunday, Simon Peter and Cleopas told Jesus himself the stories of what had happened to him. Jesus heard the stories from two others about his life. He didn't know what they knew, and he didn't know what they didn't know. They didn't know that it was Jesus, and they told him about his past 3 days. Imagine going home to your partner today and saying, let me tell you about your Wednesday through Friday at work this week. And then imagine your partner then saying to you, great, but let me tell you about all of history and how it relates to me. This is a really bizarre sentence and explanation that Jesus gives, but that's what he does. They tell him what they know about him, and then he tells them what all of history says about him. What a dialogue that day. What a set of remembrances, of reminiscences, of friends sharing a memory, and of creating one powerful enough for us to remember some 2,000 years later. For some 2,000 years later, we tell these stories too. We tell these same stories. The same story that Simon and Cleopas remembered that Sunday, we told just 2 weeks ago. And 2 weeks since, we tell the same story. We add our own stories to it. Who was at your Easter dinner? Where'd you go for brunch? What'd you eat? And what funny things did the kids say? What memories have we made for this Easter this year? And having reminded you that it is only 2 weeks since Easter, only 2 weeks since resurrection itself was renewed in its promise, how are you living this resurrection? How are you putting aside the Lenten worries and the prayers and the discernment? How are you beginning this day? If you didn't do it yesterday, start it today. If you don't get to it today, tomorrow is available too. Easter is a longer season than Lent. It's kind of funny, right? 50 days is the Easter season. Only 40 days is Lent. You would think humans that we are might need to spend more time confessing and being penitential. But turns out we need far more time and far more practice at being joyful and at remembering resurrection and of looking for hope. This is the longer season. So if you didn't get to it yesterday, if you're still clinging on to Lent, if there's still some shadows wandering about, if you're still not sure how things are ever going to get better, happy Easter. It's only been 2 weeks. We've got many, many more to go. What memories did you make 2 weeks ago, and how might remembering them or talking about them at coffee hour today, how might they bolster you for the coming week? Before we get to next week, the 4th week of Eastertide, when we'll remember again and try our best to see resurrection all around us. But in the meantime, in these working of these days, on days 11 and 12 and 13 and 14 of Eastertide, what are you doing? How are you practicing your resurrection? How are you living with resurrection? What new ways are coming into your mind? What scales and tears are falling from your eyes? How are you seeing? Are you seeing more clearly? Have you recognized Jesus walking beside you yet? What plans are you already putting in place for 50 weeks from now when we celebrate resurrection again? When again and again Easter will come. But not so fast. Today is an Easter day already. Every Sunday is, liturgically speaking. But today is your Easter. Next Sunday will be too. Resurrection is around. Memory helps us practice it. And where we share it with a friend, we make meaning for our lives.